We're only a few days away from Super Tuesday Part 2. Everybody keeps talking about Florida and Ohio, but nobody gives North Carolina any credit. Don't they know it's bow time? All right, Super Tuesday Part 2 is upon us, and we've got a slew of states that will have, of course, maybe a bigger impact on where this race moves forward than even some of the earlier contests that we've had. I want to get straight to it, starting with the delegate math. Just looking at the pledged delegates, Hillary Clinton, of course, still has a very large lead going in to another big day. She's up over 200 delegates by most counts. Just again, excluding the superdelegates, but just with the pledged, she's still up a pretty dramatic margin going into Tuesday. Same thing on the Republican side. It looks closer, right? We've got about 100 delegate or so separation between Donald Trump and Ted Cruz, but you have to remember the scale here is about actually half. So you need about half as many delegates, pledged delegates, on the Republican side as you do the Democratic side. So in this context, Donald Trump's lead over Ted Cruz is actually pretty similar to Hillary Clinton's lead over Bernie Sanders. The big difference, though, of course, is that in the Democratic contest, when you get behind by that many delegates, it gets incredibly hard to catch up because we have proportional contest. In this context, if someone like Ted Cruz started winning a lot of these winner-take-all states later on in the cycle, it could be more interesting on the GOP side in that context. We've got Marco Rubio behind here, and then John Kasich's potentially big day, of course, is also coming up in his home state of Ohio here on Tuesday. So let's look at Tuesday, starting with the Dems. Florida is the big get of the day. It's where most of the delegates are going to come from. Hillary Clinton has a huge lead here. It has a strong African-American vote. There's a strong Latino vote on the Democratic side as well. Hillary Clinton has been doing well in the South, the Southeast, amongst these voters overall this cycle. The Bernie Sanders campaign has been making an effort there, although they've admitted it's probably not the best state for them. We've seen a wild batch of polls from 20 to 40 point Clinton leads. It's probably not going to be on that high end of it, but we're still looking at another solid southern state for her. Even if it's not in Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, she's going to be netting a lot of delegates out of Florida come Tuesday. Next up, Illinois. It hasn't gotten nearly the amount of attention that it should. It's got more delegates than Ohio. A lot of folks have been talking about Ohio on the Democratic side because there's so much attention on the GOP side as well. But and coming out of Michigan, we get those Ohio comparisons. But Illinois is another delegate-rich area. We don't have a lot of polling out of either of these locations since Michigan. So if there's been any kind of Midwestern movement on the ground for the Sanders campaign, we still don't have a good read of it as of today. We should have more data hopefully come Sunday and Monday with a lot of the local papers, local press. So we'll see if there's a closing here. I think the Sanders campaign is going to do better in a place like Ohio overall. Whether he can pull off another kind of Michigan miracle where so far off on the polling, Sanders trumps a lot of the polling by 20 points. Probably doubtful, but we'll see. There are a lot of pockets of Ohio, especially in the southeast, that are going to be very favorable to the Sanders campaign. He may do well in a lot of rural Ohio as well, similar to Michigan. There are some polls that have it as a 9 or 10 point race, closer than even a lot of the Michigan polls. But then we've got these other polls that are just blowouts on the other side. In terms of 30, 35 point Clinton margins. I have a sense it's going to be closer than that. Illinois might be close, especially if the downstate vote is really strong on the Democratic side. But Clinton is definitely still heavily favored in both of these contests. Missouri, mostly the same. Most of the Democratic vote in Missouri comes out of places like St. Louis and Kansas City. The rest of the state is more rural. Sanders should drive up huge margins in most of the Missouri counties is what I'm expecting. The Clinton campaign has been going to Missouri. That's a good sign that they think it's closer as well. It's comparable, right, to some of the neighboring states that Sanders has done well. Whether he can be victorious there is to be seen, but look out for Missouri to maybe be one of the closer contests of the night. But again, we have almost no polling information there. North Carolina, on the other side, is the final southern state of this cycle. Obviously, Clinton has dominated in the South. Huge margins in South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi. Expect North Carolina to be more of a Virginia. It may even be closer than Virginia. North Carolina has a lot of recent growth. It's kind of got the Old South feel, as well as a lot of young professionals working in the Triangle, working in the banking industry in Charlotte, whatever it might be. The state is a lot more of a mix of California and New York in the South, with a mix of growing populations across the board, including a surging Latino population. So it's not quite comparable to maybe some of the other states that we've seen in the South this cycle. Again, Clinton should have a sturdy victory here, but it wouldn't surprise me if it's actually the closest of the Southern contest. No matter how you slice it, though, it comes out with something like this, right? These would just be kind of like delegate bands, delegate ranges. They're not necessarily going to hit the exact margins here, right, 430 and 259, but to give you a good indication, a bad night for Bernie Sanders might be down in this 250-ish range. If Clinton hits 30 to 40 point margins in places like Florida, it may be worse than this, but Sanders is probably in this 250 range on a bad night. If he has a really good night and it ends up in that 10 to 15% margin area, as far as still losing, but maybe being within 10 points across the board in a lot of these states, that's probably on the high end of his good night, if that's his average. That would probably get him over the 300 line. Clinton's bands, if it's a really bad night for her based on the polling, right, and again, a bad night for her means she's going to win everywhere, but just her margins are going to be smaller. She's going to have a good night, right? It's a relative when we're saying bad night. She's going to be in the maybe 375, 380 range. A good night, she's going to be well above 425. A huge night for her could still get her up to 450 delegates, again, if she's winning by 35 points in Florida. The point being, a really good night for the Sanders campaign, a good night, is still going to put him at about 310, her at about 380. He's still going to be, Clinton's still going to net 70 delegates out of this. A good night for Clinton, she's going to net more like 170, 200 delegates plus in a landslide night. It's going to be another good night for the Clinton campaign based on what we're seeing. Again, if there are any surprises, look for the Midwest. Look at Illinois, Missouri, Ohio. We'll see. It might be a lot closer like Michigan. I just can't make that prediction based on the data I see. The comps are a little bit of a different story. Okay, let's go to the GOP side. This is where things suddenly get a lot more interesting than where a lot of these GOP contests have even been, because we have the introduction of winner-take-all states. Florida is the biggest one of the day, almost 100 delegates at stake, winner-take-all. There are some signs that Rubio may be a little bit closer. It's his home state. If there's polling, if the polling that's accurate shows him down 5 or 6, weirder things have happened. You never want to bet against the person who it's their own home state, making up a few points based on that home state machine turnout effort. You could shock the world that way. Same thing with Kasich in Ohio. More in a second on that. But there's another big batch of polls here that still show this to be a Trump landslide. The thing that I think is most telling, the best news for Trump, Florida is probably actually his best looking state of the night, is that Trump's been at 40 to 48% in the Florida polls all cycle. Even if you have some states where Trump underperforms or somebody overperforms throughout the cycle, Trump does a really good job of kind of hitting his number, that number where he's been since even October in a lot of these states. It sure seems like there's a good chance he's going to be close to that 40% margin or so. That makes a Rubio victory very challenging. Even in some of the post-March 8th contests, there are now a slew of polls that even have Ted Cruz within the margin of error of Marco Rubio. So if Marco Rubio is having a bad night, suddenly Ted Cruz could even be in second here, right? There's a lot of volatility in this data. Never bet against the home candidate, but it really isn't looking good for the Rubio campaign, of course. North Carolina is actually the second biggest get of the night. Give it attention, except one thing. North Carolina is the only true proportional vote of the night. So is the Cruz campaign close here? I think so. Ted Cruz, this has been one of his better southern states all cycle. He's well organized. It's actually been one of Donald Trump's weakest southern states, again, for a lot of the reasons that I said earlier on the Democratic side. It's a lot different from what maybe folks outside of North Carolina might expect of the state. There's a huge white-collar working base finance industry in Charlotte. We're in a very international research area here in RTP. The Cruz campaign is very strong in some of the rural parts of the state. What is interesting, though, is Ben Carson's campaign was also very, very strong here for much of the cycle. Whether his endorsement makes a difference or not, I don't know, although it certainly can't hurt Donald Trump in this state. It may be close. Maybe Ted Cruz pulls off a shocking upset here in some ways. A lot of the data has been closer than you've seen elsewhere, that if Cruz is only down 6 or 10 points in the polls, he's actually made up those gaps in places like Louisiana, where a lot of the data was a 20-point race, and then he loses by 4 or so points. So North Carolina could have maybe an upset on the top, or maybe Trump wins by 5, 8 points as kind of expected. But either way, it's a difference of a few delegates, and that's why North Carolina hasn't got as much attention. Illinois, though, and Missouri I want to talk about together. We've got about 120 pledged delegates here. These aren't pure winner-take-all contests, unless in Missouri you win 50% of the vote, which is unlikely that any candidate hits 50%. But a lot of these in Missouri, winner-take-all by congressional districts in a lot of cases, plus some statewide numbers. Illinois also has some of these winner-take-all dynamics based on a few different factors. There's a huge sway here of dozens and dozens of delegates based on if Ted Cruz maybe wins a few congressional districts by a point, but maybe Donald Trump wins the state with some bigger margins in other districts, Ted Cruz could suddenly have a much better night, or vice versa. So there's a lot of interesting play in both Illinois and Missouri, with a batch of delegates that combined is more than Florida. So if Ted Cruz is going to have a good night, he may win in some of these contests that have gotten almost no attention. His campaign is organized in these states. If he's able to turn it out, he may do well. The other thing, though, to consider is Trump also has some strong support in places like suburban Chicago or suburban St. Louis, right? He doesn't just play well in the rural areas by any means. He plays well a lot in some of these kind of suburban counties or even urban counties. So you have to remember his map in Michigan was strong across the board. So look out for it. These contests are going to be, I think, closer than a lot of people are paying attention to. And that difference of 3 or 5 points here probably makes more of a difference across all these contests all night. Because let's say Rubio surprises with how close it is and only loses by 3 in Florida. As long as you are still losing the state, you're getting 0 delegates out of Florida, but these 3 or 5 point switches matter a lot here. Then we're down to Ohio, John Kasich's last stand. A lot of the polling is kind of all over the place in some way as far as who's ahead, but it's been in pretty consistent bands, anywhere from a slight Kasich lead to a lot of pollsters showing a slight Trump lead. Historically, over the cycle, if Trump is only up 2 or 3 points here in a state where there is also the home state person, I'd say Kasich probably has the advantage if we're going into Tuesday morning and it looks like either one could be ahead. Again, I'd probably give that advantage to Kasich. A huge difference here whether it's Trump +3, Kasich +3, because again, Ohio's winner take all. So what does this actually look like? Well, on a bad night, it still looks like Donald Trump's going to win Florida. So this is assuming he's got Florida in the bag. But of course, if Donald Trump loses across the board, which again require Florida, he's not going to even get this 169. He would get something like 69, and we're going to have a very different conversation. Trump could only win Florida on Tuesday. There could be upsets in Missouri. There could be upsets in North Carolina and upsets in Illinois with the Cruz campaign. Kasich, of course, can win Ohio. Trump's plus or minus 3 or 5% range on Tuesday could easily push him anywhere from 1 victory to 5 victories, and none of it would surprise me based on where these states are at, coupled with the very little data we have from these states. But again, I'm assuming Trump's going to win Florida. Bad night still puts him at 169. As you can see, no matter how good of a night some of these other candidates have, Trump's going to keep building delegates, even just with a victory in Florida. Trump's going to have a good night overall. If he has more victories in other states, Trump's going to have a fantastic night. He's going to be up more in this 260 range with no one else even within 150 delegates. That's going to be a huge separator, even though we've got winner-take-all states left. Cruz's night also potentially varied depending on how he does. Not so much just in North Carolina, but again, Missouri and Illinois are going to make a big difference whether Cruz is in this 50-60 range or whether Cruz could get 100 delegates for the night. Again, that could keep him close to Trump, especially if there's somehow a huge shock and Rubio wins Florida after all. Rubio's night looks like he's just going to get some of these proportional delegates. Unless he gets that victory in Florida, he's probably locked into this 20 delegate, 30 delegate range, maybe. And then Kasich's got a big gap here. The big difference between just picking up 20 or 30 delegates for the night and being done versus maybe about 100 delegates if he gets that big batch out of Ohio. It all comes down to Ohio to him. So again, the Democratic race is all about margins at this point. Whether Sanders wins any one of these states, I'm not sure. I don't see it. But we have got huge questions as far as the margins. Technically, if he stays closer in a lot of these contexts, the delegate math is going to stay closer. We still have a lot of good states for him later on. But on the Republican side, there's a whole lot of volatility when we look at all 5 of these states, and especially states like Illinois and Missouri. We'll see how Ohio and Florida come out early on in the night. That's what's going to drive the headlines. But if they're close or if there are any kind of surprises early on, Ted Cruz is going to stay in this race and be still very competitive if he pulls off some upsets in some of these congressional districts. If he doesn't, Donald Trump's going to pull away big time come Tuesday. It's going to be an interesting night. I look forward to it. I'll be on Twitter as always. Until then.